Dusk hung low over the wire fence, the air damp and heavy with the smell of boiled rice gone sour. Inside the camp, female Japanese POWs shifted restlessly, their silhouettes thin against the fading light. Then, boots on gravel, not the usual guard stomp, but something lighter, quicker. Through the gate walked a line of women in crisp uniforms, bearing the unmistakable Red Cross stitched onto armbands. Crates bumped against their knees as they carried them past the watchtowers. The scene froze the camp for a heartbeat. No one had imagined strangers would walk in carrying boxes that promised life instead of punishment. NNTHE guards did not bark, did not block. Instead, they stepped aside, rifles slung loosely, as if even they understood the rules were different now. For the prisoners who had spent months rationing thin gruel and scratching mosquito bites into infections, this was unthinkable. Reports indicate that by 1944-45, over 24,000 Red Cross parcels had made their way across Asia despite blockades and bombardments. But for these women, numbers meant little. What mattered was that those wooden crates looked heavier than food. Something rattled inside. Glass, not tin. And faces pressed to barbed wire, eyes wide, they whispered to each other. Medicine? The word itself was a shock. In their own army hospitals, medicine had been a rarity, reserved for officers or hoarded for frontline men. The idea that foreign women, outsiders, enemies, were now dragging it through mud and danger into their prison seemed absurd. We thought medicine was only for their own wounded, one survivor recalled decades later. That disbelief hung in the air stronger than the smell of sweat and kerosene lamps, and boots scuffed against dust, crates thudded down, and silence followed like a drumbeat. The nurses paused, glancing around the rows of hollowed faces staring back. Then one reached into her satchel and set a small glass vial on the crate lid. The sunlight caught it, refracting into a spark. A hush rolled through the crowd as if every woman understood at once. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't propaganda. This was medicine. Here. Now. NNTHE shock of arrival narrowed into something sharper. The focus on those fragile bottles inside the barbed wire and the question of what would happen next. As the crates landed with a dull thud, the camp seemed to draw one collective breath. Shadows lengthened across the gravel yard, but the light clung to the women pressing forward, fingers curling through gaps in the barbed wire. Faces emerged from the dim barracks, hollow cheeks, cracked lips, eyes sunken yet suddenly alive. They stood shoulder to shoulder, silent, unwilling to believe the moment. The rustle of clothing against the fence was louder than any voice. It was disbelief made visible. A guard coughed, shifted uneasily, but did not raise his weapon. The strange inversion of roles struck everyone. Enemy women at the mercy of American guards, yet those guards stepping aside to let aid pass. Malnutrition had already ravaged these prisoners. Reports estimate that in some camps, up to 40% of female POWs suffered wasting diseases. Bones jutted against skin like fragile scaffolding. The camp smelled of mildew and infection, a place where hope had been starved out. And now, medicine had arrived, carried by women who could have stayed safe behind lines. One prisoner reached out her hand, trembling, not to grab but simply to feel the air stirred by passing crates. It was a gesture halfway between worship and disbelief. Another whispered, "Our officers never gave us such care." The irony burned. For years they had been taught that the enemy was cruel, ruthless, incapable of compassion. Yet here was proof otherwise, brought not in speeches, but in glass, gauze, and the quiet bravery of nurses moving through silence. NNFOR a few moments. The fence was not barrier but stage, both sides staring across it, struggling to translate what their eyes told them into what their minds could accept. It was not yet trust, but it was more than suspicion. Hunger and fever had worn down cynicism, leaving only raw astonishment. NNTHE crates were opened, wood splintering as nails came loose. Inside, bottles clinked like a fragile orchestra. Nurses pulled out small glass vials, their contents catching the last of the evening sun. Against the backdrop of wire and exhaustion, the sight was electric. Hope took form in liquid, measured in milliliters. And the next question became clear. How would it be used? And who among them would feel its touch first? The crack of wood splitting echoed across the campyard, sharp and foreign against the usual monotony of clanging tin bowls and distant coughs. A nurse pried open the crate lid with the blunt edge of a bayonet borrowed from a guard. The sound made even the sentries glance over, half expecting contraband, half curious at what these women carried so far under fire. Then, slowly, the box revealed its secret, rows of tiny glass ampoules, nested in straw, glinting in the last shafts of sunlight, NNTHE, air-thickened. For prisoners accustomed to scraping rust from water cans and reusing rags as bandages, these delicate vials looked like treasure. One nurse held up a small ampoule of quinine, its clear liquid glowing faintly. Another raised a syringe, gleaming steel in contrast to the POWs' bruised arms. By 1945, Allied supply chains were moving thousands of doses monthly across the Pacific, even as submarines prowled the seas. Every vial that reached this camp was a miracle pulled through storms, bombs, and bureaucracy. NNTHE prisoners whispered among themselves, their words jagged with awe. One vial here meant 10 lives spared, one woman would later recall. Malaria, dysentery, infections, illnesses that once meant certain death suddenly faced an enemy of their own. Yet, disbelief hung heavy. Why would the enemy risk their own supplies for women once taught to despise them? That question lingered, unspoken but palpable, as the vials caught the light. NNTHE nurses wasted no time. Cotton swabs appeared, alcohol sting sharp in the air. Hands moved with efficiency, born of repetition. The first ampoules were cracked open with practiced precision, their contents drawn into needles. A hush fell over the yard, broken only by the faint hiss of lantern flames. Some prisoners stepped forward, sleeves rolled, their bodies trembling, not only from fever, but from the enormity of being touched with care by an enemy hand. NNFOR, every injection, for every careful press of gauze, the line of women seemed to lean closer, pulled by hope. And as the needles emptied, the deeper story emerged, not just of medicine given, but of journeys endured to bring it here. Because these ampoules, fragile as glass, had traveled through fire and sabotage to reach this forgotten fence, that journey itself would soon unfold. Long before those crates scraped the campyard, their story had been written in smoke and steel. The medicine had not arrived by chance. It had been dragged across oceans and borders like contraband of mercy. Picture a freight train rattling through jungled tracks, its carriages darkened to avoid strafing runs. Nurses sat atop the crates, arms wrapped around them, as if their bodies could shield glass from shrapnel. The hiss of steam mixed with the distant whine of enemy aircraft. Every minute another gamble from the docks. Liberty ships took the burden next. Each one stuffed with food, bandages, and medicine. 200,000 tons of medical aid moved under constant threat. Convoys zigzagged across the Pacific to dodge torpedoes. Nurses traveled alongside sailors, praying that the Red Cross painted on canvas covers would be respected. But respect was no armor. Records confirmed that even marked ships were shelled, some sunk with all cargo lost. Still, the effort never stopped. Where one convoy failed, another followed. There were nights when the crates moved on trucks through villages swallowed in blackout. Headlights dimmed, wheels crunching gravel under silence. Reports describe ambushes narrowly missed, with convoys slipping through enemy zones by hours, sometimes minutes. And always, the nurses clutched their cargo tighter than their own belongings. Letters from survivors recall the mantra repeated on sleepless nights. If this reaches them, lives will be saved. It was not glory that carried the crates forward, but sheer, stubborn courage. Even their enemies later admitted it. "Even their women risked death for us," one POW whispered, after realizing where those ampoules had traveled. The thought unsettled more than it comforted. For a culture raised on duty to emperor and hierarchy, the image of enemy women braving submarines and bombs for strangers behind wire was almost incomprehensible. And yet, through fire and fear, the crates kept moving. Past bomb craters, under strafing skies, across seas dotted with wreckage, until finally they rattled into the yard of a prison camp where disbelief still smothered hope. That night, as lanterns hissed and glass vials were lined up, the meaning of those journeys began to pierce the silence. What the crates carried was no longer just medicine. It was risk made visible, courage made tangible. The crates had been cracked open, the glass revealed, but the true silence fell only when the first lanterns hissed to life. Their glow cut sharp against the bamboo walls of the yard, shadows crawling over faces that had seen too much disease, too little care. A nurse knelt beside a crate, metal tray balanced on her lap, and placed the first syringes down like ritual objects. Cotton swabs, alcohol flasks, thin needles catching the flame. They became symbols more powerful than weapons. NNTHE women stepped forward hesitantly, sleeves rolled up with trembling fingers. For many, it was the first time anyone had offered to heal them since their capture. Malaria had ravaged this camp for months. Untreated cases carried a mortality rate of over 30%. To those prisoners, the sting of a needle now felt like an impossible reprieve. Even the guards, usually restless, stood still, their rifles lowered but eyes fixed on the scene as though they too were witnessing something beyond protocol. One nurse sterilized the first needle by holding it to the lamp, then cooled it with practiced breath. She drew liquid from a small ampoule, tapping the glass with 2 quick clicks. Then the act, insertion, pressure, a faint hiss as life entered blood. The prisoner flinched, then relaxed, head dropping as if years of pain had lifted in a single second. From the shadows came the sound of muffled sobs, not of fear, but of release. "They touched us as if we were human again," one woman later recalled. It was a small gesture, a hand steadying an elbow, a cloth pressed gently against skin, but it shattered walls higher than the barbed wire outside. For women who had been treated as expendable by their own command, such touches struck harder than any sermon. The injections became a rhythm: cotton, needle, press, gauze. Another life pulled back from the edge. NNTHE air filled with the smell of antiseptic, sharp and alien, in a camp that had known only sweat, mud, and rot. Each ampoule emptied was a victory. Each patient treated a challenge to everything these women had been taught about enemies. And as the last vials glimmered in lamplight, the weight of what had just happened began to settle. For the first time, compassion had crossed the line of war, and it raised a question bigger than the medicine itself. What did it mean when enemy women saved enemy women? When the needles were set aside and the vials emptied, the camp did not return to noise. Instead, a strange stillness followed, broken only by the shuffle of feet. The Japanese women stepped back, hands folded, and then, almost in unison, bowed low to the nurses. It was instinct, not performance, a gesture deeply ingrained, usually reserved for authority or ancestors. The nurses paused, unsure, their eyes meeting briefly in silent question. Then, awkward but sincere, one bent her head forward in return. An NTHAT moment rippled through the yard. The bow, repeated again and again, was an offering of respect in a place where respect had been stripped away. For the prisoners, it was the only language left to them. For the nurses, it was confusing, almost surreal. Reports indicate that nearly 70% of Red Cross personnel working in Asia spoke no Japanese, and interpreters were scarce. Yet words were unnecessary. The gesture itself spoke louder than any translation. NNTHE prisoners straightened slowly, eyes glistening, while the nurses reached into pockets and produced small gestures of their own. A folded handkerchief pressed into a palm, a gentle pat on a shoulder, the kind of contact that crossed culture even when speech could not. One nurse scribbled on a scrap of paper, drawing a crude heart to make her meaning clear. The prisoner who received it clutched the drawing like scripture. Kindness needed no words. One woman would later confess. The irony was sharp. Their own officers had shouted commands, barked orders, left them untreated when sickness spread. Yet here, in silence broken only by gestures and bowed heads, a different kind of order was established, one built on empathy, not rank. It was disorienting, almost destabilizing, for women raised to believe enemy hands could only bring pain. NNTHE bowing continued until some of the prisoners collapsed forward, knees buckling from exhaustion and emotion. Tears ran quietly down faces as they tried to reconcile what they felt. In the nurses' eyes, the moment was humbling, but for the prisoners, it was a collision of worlds, duty colliding with mercy, propaganda colliding with lived reality. And that collision did not fade when the lanterns dimmed. Instead, it followed the women back into their barracks, where the dam of silence finally cracked and sobs could no longer be held in. Night settled heavy over the camp, the lanterns long extinguished, but inside the wooden barracks another light flickered, the sound of suppressed crying. Women lay on straw mats, their thin blankets pulled over faces, shoulders trembling. At first it was one or two, muffled sobs hidden in sleeves. Then more joined, until the sound filled the barrack like a tide, soft and uneven, breaking the silence that had ruled for months. This was not the wailing of sickness or despair. It was something else entirely. NNFOR, many, the shock of being treated with care, had finally broken through the armor of survival. To be touched gently, injected with medicine, spoken to with respect, it was a rupture. We cried not from pain, but from recognition, one survivor later explained. Recognition that they were seen, recognized as women, not statistics or pawns. For years, even before capture, they had been expected to endure without complaint, to fade quietly into duty. The simple act of someone placing a cloth on a fevered brow had undone that silence. American guards pacing outside the barracks heard the crying and paused. One leaned against the post, listening, his face unreadable in the moonlight. These were the same prisoners they had been told were hardened enemies, yet their tears carried no malice. Reports from camp diaries note that in just 1 week after that visit, at least 12 fever cases began recovering thanks to treatment. But the tears weren't about numbers. They were about the weight of suddenly believing survival was possible. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and disinfectant still lingering from the nurses' work. Women clutched each other's hands, whispering gratitude too soft for guards to catch. Others simply turned toward the wall, letting the flood of emotion run unchecked. For the first time in months, some allowed themselves to imagine a tomorrow. NNTHE sound drifted beyond the barracks, through the wire, into the yard where guards now stood unusually still. It wasn't the noise of weakness, it was the sound of walls collapsing, of humanity forcing its way back through. And in that moment, the guards themselves felt an unease they could not name, a shifting in their own perceptions. Because if enemies could cry in relief at mercy, then what did that make the men watching over them? The question lingered in the night, unanswered, as the guards exchanged glances under the dim moonlight. The crying from the barracks did not fade quickly. It drifted into the yard, a low chorus carried on the night air, reaching the guards who leaned on their rifles. At first, they looked at one another, uncertain whether to intervene. But none barked orders, none told the women to quiet down. Instead, their faces softened into something rarely seen behind wire. Curiosity. Maybe even respect. One sergeant, usually brisk with his rounds, stopped at the doorway and listened longer than his orders allowed. NNTHE Red Cross nurses, who had been told their time was nearly up, found themselves quietly granted more. American guards extended their stay by hours, bending rules that were usually inflexible. Official records note that in several camps, visits stretched 2 or even 3 hours beyond agreed schedules, simply because soldiers allowed it. In those moments, procedure gave way to something else. The sound of sobbing and the sight of frail women clutching each other seemed to disarm even men trained to see enemies in every uniform. And then FOR the prisoners, the shock doubled. Guards who once patrolled with suspicion now stood back, giving them space to grieve, to heal. One woman later wrote in testimony, "Even their soldiers softened in those moments." It was not the nurses alone who broke barriers, but the ripple effect their presence had on the very men tasked with enforcing the fence. It unsettled the prisoners, who were used to strict lines drawn between captor and captive, enemy and victim. NNTHAT night, the guards, silence became part of the medicine. Their lack of interruption allowed the women to release grief that had festered like an untreated wound. Watching from their posts, the soldiers themselves seemed to carry the weight of realization. These prisoners were not abstractions. They were human, fragile, capable of gratitude and tears. The hard edge of enemy began to blur NNBUT, the very act of kindness, threw another truth into sharp relief. For the prisoners, memories of their own officers, who had denied them even scraps of aid, pressed back against the present. The contrast was unbearable. Guards from another land showing mercy their own command had refused. And that comparison would haunt them as strongly as the sound of the nurses' footsteps leaving camp. The quiet mercy of nurses and guards stirred a darker echo in the prisoners' minds. As they lay awake on rough mats, memory clawed back images of their own officers, shouts that split the air, commands that silenced pleas, boots that passed by fevers without pause. They remembered wounds left to fester until infection consumed whole limbs, and fevers that burned unchecked because quinine and penicillin were deemed too precious for them. Each gesture of kindness now sharpened those recollections like glass against skin. One woman whispered to another, voice trembling with bitterness, "Our own leaders left us to rot." It wasn't exaggeration. Historical reports estimate that over 10,000 Japanese POWs, men and women, died from untreated diseases across the war years. Malaria, dysentery, tuberculosis, simple cuts gone septic, all preventable yet untreated. Medicine existed, but it was hoarded for senior officers or wasted in bureaucratic neglect. The hierarchy had drawn its line. Some lives mattered, others could be discarded. In contrast, here in a foreign camp, the line blurred. Enemy hands held their arms steady for injections. Enemy nurses pressed cloths against wounds their own country had ignored. The irony burned worse than any fever. To accept this medicine was not just to accept survival. It was to confront betrayal. Every vial injected carried a second sting, a reminder of abandonment by the very command they had once sworn loyalty to. NNTHE flashbacks came unbidden, standing at attention while officers distributed meager rations, watching comrades collapse during roll call, hearing silence when they begged for bandages. Against those memories, the present scene of nurses quietly offering bread with pills seemed unreal. Bread warm enough to steam in the night air, pills placed gently into waiting hands, symbols of the sharpest contrast they had ever lived. NNTHE Camp Yard became a place of impossible dualities. Outside the fence, their nation's banners still waved in defiance. Inside the fence, the truth was undeniable. Survival came not from their leaders, but from the very people they had been told were monsters. And that recognition reshaped every glance, every thought, every mouthful of bread and medicine swallowed under the watch of the Red Cross. Morning light seeped into the camp through gaps in the planks, carrying with it the smell of something nearly forgotten: fresh bread. The nurses had not only brought glass vials and gauze, but loaves wrapped in cloth, their crusts still soft from ovens far outside the wire. Women shuffled forward, hesitant, as slices were torn and passed into their hands. The bread was paired with pills, chalky tablets pressed into palms alongside food. Medicine and sustenance, survival delivered in tandem. NNTHE contrast was overwhelming. In a place where meals usually meant thin gruel and scraps, the taste of warm flour felt like decadence. Crumbs stuck to dry lips, and some prisoners wept silently as they chewed. One later recalled, "Even their bread tasted like mercy." It wasn't simply food. It was a signal that life was worth preserving, that healing wasn't reserved for the privileged few. Each mouthful stood in defiance of everything they had endured from their own command. NNTHE statistics behind the gesture were staggering. Red Cross records confirm that over 7 million cigarettes and thousands of tons of flour, milk, and sugar entered POW camps during the war years. Each crate carried not only calories but a message. Compassion could be rationed just as strictly as cruelty, but here, the balance shifted. In the mouths of women who had once starved, the bread became proof of abundance. NNFOR, the guards, it was a strange sight. Enemies fed by enemy hands, sharing food with a reverence usually reserved for ritual. The barbed wire seemed to lose some of its meaning in that moment. Women who had once been defined only as prisoners now sat hunched together, biting bread slowly, as though afraid to finish too soon. Alongside each slice came a tablet, tiny and bitter, yet swallowed like treasure. Medicine and bread, symbols intertwined so tightly that they could not be separated. NNBUT, within that gentleness, lurked another truth. Every loaf, every pill, every vial had been carried into the camp at risk. The women eating now could not know the full danger yet, but the nurses had lived it. The convoys attacked, the ships sunk, the bullets ignored for the sake of getting here. Soon, the story of that risk would bleed into the camp, altering how the prisoners saw the nurses who moved quietly among them. The Red Cross stitched on canvas bags and armbands was meant to be protection, but in war, it often became a bullseye. As the nurses moved between barracks and supply crates, the symbol was impossible to miss. It caught the eyes of guards in the towers and beyond the camp, the bombers that sometimes roared overhead. The nurses knew this. The choice to stay visible was deliberate. They carried their identity openly, even when it made them targets, in a world where rules of war were often ignored. Motied prisoners tilted their heads upward when engines rumbled through the sky. They had seen what strafing could do. Planks splintered, earth cratered, bodies torn apart in seconds. Yet the nurses never flinched. They walked calmly across the yard, arms steady, distributing vials and loaves with the discipline of soldiers. Geneva records later noted dozens of Red Cross personnel killed in crossfire, some while wearing the same emblems sewn onto these women's uniforms. Still, they moved as if the risk had been accepted long before. NNFOR, the POWs. The sight was almost unbearable. They had been raised to believe self-preservation was the highest form of loyalty to emperor and nation. Watching enemy nurses risk themselves openly, not for their own countrymen but for captives, cracked that worldview apart. One Japanese prisoner later admitted, "They could have hidden, but they stayed visible for us." The disbelief was not in the medicine itself, but in the courage wrapped around it. And guards noticed too. Some muttered about how foolish it was, walking exposed under hostile skies. Others fell silent, unwilling to mock what they could not explain. For the prisoners, however, the lesson cut deeper. Every step a nurse took in plain sight was a reminder that humanity had its own form of defiance. They weren't just delivering medicine. They were standing against the logic of fear that dominated the war. As the day wore on, shadows of aircraft passed across the camp, momentarily darkening the ground. Prisoners held their breath. But the nurses kept moving, heads bowed only to check supplies, never to duck in fear. That image imprinted itself into memory. Women, marked by red crosses, walking targets who refused to hide. And within that refusal, stories of individual courage began to surface, stories that would outlast the war itself. The alarm siren split the camp with its metallic wail, a signal everyone knew too well. Guards shouted, pointing to the sky, while prisoners huddled under roofs that offered no real shelter. But in the yard, one nurse refused to move. She had a patient stretched on a wooden bench, a wound stitched hastily but still bleeding. Her colleagues glanced back, torn between orders to evacuate and their oath to heal. She didn't hesitate. With hands steady under the tremor of nearby blasts, she threaded her needle through flesh as if the sky itself were silent. The prisoner beneath her clenched teeth, but her eyes fixed on the nurse's calm face. Every tremor of earth threatened to snap the moment, yet the needle kept moving, precise and relentless. Records later noted that during one extended visit, 14 women were saved through emergency procedures carried out under active alerts. It was not strategy, not technology. It was resolve embodied in a single pair of hands. NNTHE bombs did not fall directly on the camp that day, but the sound of explosions painted the horizon. Guards gestured urgently, but the nurse waved them off without breaking rhythm. Gauze pressed down, blood staunched, the wounds sealed. Finally, she looked up, sweat streaking her face, and only then did she allow herself to retreat to the shelter. The patient lived, her fever broken days later. NNFOR, the Japanese POWs watching from the shadows, the image was seared into memory. Their own officers had abandoned them at the first sign of weakness, yet here was an enemy woman, young, foreign, vulnerable, choosing to risk death for one of them. Her hands were steady, even as bombs fell, one survivor whispered years later. It was not only the medicine that broke them, it was the realization that compassion could outlast fear, even under the roar of engines. NTHAT act of defiance rippled through the camp. Prisoners whispered the story in barracks long after, retelling it like scripture. The worldview they had been raised with, of ruthless enemies and merciless outsiders, was already cracking. The sight of that nurse, unshaken under fire, drove the fracture deeper. And in the days that followed, the prisoners found themselves rethinking not only their captors, but the very foundations of what they had believed about war, loyalty, and humanity. Long after the echoes of the air raid faded, the prisoners lay awake in their barracks, whispering in low voices that carried through the planks. They spoke not of bombs or guards, but of the nurse who had stitched wounds beneath sirens. Their words circled back to one truth. Everything they had been taught about Americans was breaking apart. Propaganda had painted them as monsters, soulless invaders who would crush captives without mercy. Yet what they had seen were steady hands, shared bread, and quiet courage that defied the image. NNTHE dissonance was unbearable. Some women resisted the thought, insisting it was trickery or performance. But as fevered bodies cooled, as infections eased, denial grew harder to maintain. By the war's end, surveys of released POWs showed that nearly 60% described Red Cross visits as the moment their perception of the enemy began to change. In these cramped barracks, that transformation had already begun. NNTHE women replayed scenes in hushed tones, the first ampoule raised to sunlight, the bow exchanged in silence, the bread passed into hands too weak to hold. Every detail contradicted years of indoctrination. We began to doubt everything we'd been told, one survivor later admitted. Doubt is quiet but powerful. It seeps through walls more surely than fire. And in this camp, it spread from mat to mat, carried in whispers that sounded more like confession than conversation. Yet the shift was not without pain. With every realization came the shadow of betrayal. If the enemy showed them mercy, Why had their own leaders denied it? That question sat heavy in the air, unspoken yet pressing. Tears returned, softer now, less desperate, more reflective. Some clasped small tokens given by nurses, a handkerchief, a crude drawing, even a pill bottle kept empty, as proof that kindness had not been imagined. NNTHE guards sensed the change, though they could not name it. They noticed eyes that no longer looked down in pure submission, but up with a fragile curiosity. It was not rebellion, but it was no longer the same defeat either. The camp itself felt altered, as though one visit had redrawn its emotional boundaries. In NBUT, the prisoners knew visits could not last forever. The nurses would soon pack their crates and leave, and with their departure, a new question loomed. What would remain once the sound of footsteps faded through the gate? By late afternoon, the light began to shift, stretching long shadows across the gravel yard. The nurses moved quietly, methodically repacking what little remained: empty vials, gauze wrappers, half-used crates of bread. Their hands were slower now, not from fatigue but from the weight of leaving. The prisoners sensed it immediately. They gathered at the fence without orders, their hollow faces drawn tight with anticipation of absence. NNTHE guards, who once barked time limits, stood still. One sergeant even lifted a hand in salute as the nurses closed their satchels. It was an unofficial gesture, not in any manual, but born of respect for what had unfolded in the last hours. The rules said Red Cross visits rarely lasted longer than 6 or 8 hours. By then, convoys had to move again, back to safer ground, back into the uncertainty of roads and skies. This camp was no exception. NNTHE prisoners pressed closer, their hands curling through barbed wire, eyes unblinking. Not one asked aloud for them to stay. Silence carried the plea better than words. Some bowed deeply, their frail bodies shaking with the effort. Others simply stood rigid, eyes fixed on the departing figures, as though imprinting them into memory. One woman muttered to another, voice trembling, "We feared it would be the last time." NNTHE nurses did not offer promises. They knew better than to speak what they couldn't guarantee. Instead, one reached out and placed a folded handkerchief into a prisoner's hand through the wire. Another smiled faintly, bowing her head before turning away. These small gestures became heavier than the crates themselves. For the prisoners, they were evidence that compassion had entered their world, if only briefly. And boots scuffed gravel as the convoy formed, crates lifted onto trucks. Engines sputtered, gears ground, and the camp's silence deepened. Prisoners stayed rooted to the fence long after the last figure passed through the gate. Dust lingered in the air, stirred by departing wheels, carrying with it the echo of voices and the faint scent of bread. When the sound finally faded, what remained was absence, but also something else. Within the hollow quiet, memory began to grow roots. The prisoners would carry this day far beyond the wire, even as war continued outside. And in time, that memory would not fade but sharpen, shaping the way they told their stories for decades to come. Decades later, when the war had long ended and the barbed wire was nothing more than rusted scrap in forgotten fields, the memories remained vivid. Survivors, now elderly, sat before interviewers with trembling hands and voices cracked by time. They spoke not of battles or generals, but of faces, young nurses with firm hands, steady eyes, and satchels marked by a red cross. These women, strangers once defined as enemies, had left impressions deeper than scars. Some survivors clutched small relics, a faded handkerchief, a Red Cross wrapper, a photograph smuggled in by chance. Each object carried the weight of a moment when mercy had cut through war's brutality. Oral histories collected after 1945 record more than 300 female POW testimonies, many circling back to the same story. They didn't remember the names of the nurses, but they remembered the feeling of being treated as human again. That memory outlasted propaganda, outlasted shame, outlasted silence. Those women proved enemies could carry humanity. One former POW reflected, her voice quiet but unwavering. It was a sentence heavy, with both gratitude and pain. Gratitude for the aid, pain for the realization that their own leaders had denied them such care. The contradiction shaped how they told their children, how they wrote in diaries, how they faced their own reflections. And time softened nothing. The recollection of injections under lantern light, of bread shared like communion, of nurses walking visible under bombers, these details remained sharp. Survivors repeated them with the clarity of people who knew the moments had defined them. For some, it was the first crack in blind loyalty. For others, it was the seed of reconciliation. For all, it was proof that compassion had survived the war even when politics and violence tried to erase it. An NTHE legacy did not belong only to those who lived it. By telling, retelling, and recording, the women ensured the memory lived beyond them. The story of the Red Cross nurses became a quiet thread in the larger tapestry of World War II, a reminder that humanity can appear where least expected, and that sometimes its power outlives victory and defeat alike. And so, the war ended, but the image did not fade. Women marked by a Red Cross, stepping into danger not for glory, but for lives forgotten behind wire. Memory turned them into something larger than uniforms, symbols that even in war's darkest corners, mercy could find a way in.